There are many things that make our nation unique, and American art is one of them. Art is a reflection of the time and place it is created. The Butler Institute of American Art in Youngstown, Ohio, was the first building specifically built to house an American art collection. The museum was founded over a century ago in 1919 by Joseph G. Butler, Jr., and is nationally acclaimed, where our sole focus is the art of America. The Butler has one of the premier collections of American art in the nation, including 22,000 artworks. To walk through the Butler galleries is to walk through the history of America. Join me as we explore our treasures. 4 centuries of American art. American Realism was a style in art, music, and literature that depicted contemporary social realities and the lives and everyday activities of ordinary people. The movement began in literature in the mid-19th century and became an important tendency in visual art in the early 20th century. Whether a cultural portrayal or a scenic view of downtown New York City, American realist artworks were attempting to define what was real. The U.S. movement emerged embracing realistic depiction, whose followers include members of the Ashcan School, a movement within American realism that came into prominence in New York City and is best known for works portraying scenes of daily life in New York City's poorer neighborhoods. The Ashcan School, also known as the Eight, and the group called 10 American Painters, created the core of the new American modernism in the visual arts. Known for its gritty urban subject matter, dark palette, and gestural brushwork, the Ashcan School was a loosely knit group of artists based in New York City who were inspired by the painter Robert Henri. The group believed in the worthiness of immigrant and working class life as artistic subject matter and in an art that depicted the real rather than an elitist ideal. While their subject matter was revolutionary, their manner of painting finds precedence in the realism of the 17th century Spanish and Dutch art, and also with 19th century French painting. In the United States, prior to the arrival of the Ashcan School, American Impressionism, with its pleasing and luscious displays of the feminine and peaceful scenes, held great influence. We look at the portraits created by 3 artists of this period. Their techniques and styles are reflective of their individuality. Chuck Close, currently 90 years old, creates massive scale photorealist portraits based on photographs of family, friends, and other artists. In this case, the subject for his portrait is his daughter, Georgia, done in 1984. Through the use of handmade paper and a Renaissance-style grid system, Close achieved 36 different values of gray in this composition. Georgia is staring at the viewer, and the gaze in her eyes pulls us into a deeper look at the composition as our eyes travel through her facial features. Tousled hair and the strong contrast of gray values against the lightest of gray in the background. Born in Columbus, Ohio, in 1882, George Bellows was America's strongest realist painter in the first quarter of the 20th century. As a very talented athlete, his attention to sports-related scenes showed action and energetic brushstrokes. This oil portrait exemplifies Bellows' attention to paintings created in the ashcan manner, ordinary city types of people painted quickly and generally in dark colors. Notice the definition of space, geometric shapes, and balance in this composition. Geraldine is centered on the canvas facing the viewer as she is aligned against the back of the chair and positioned against the lines of the drapery in the background. Notice the textural quality of paint in the chair and background as Bellows used wide, quick brush strokes. We look at the simple color palette he used, creating the color blocks of shape in the chair, Geraldine's dress, and the drapery and white background. Just as Chuck Close created large-scale portraits, Harvey Dinnerstein chose to portray many of his subjects in full length. The portrait of Maggie was painted in 1985, 1 year after Chuck Close's portrait of his daughter. Dinnerstein, 92, is known as a figurative artist, carefully depicting the human figure with a strong interest in cultural and moral issues. Like George Bellows, his focus was on genre painting, representing everyday life. Here is Maggie. What's on her mind? Does she look like anyone you know? Look at her stance with her eyes glaring down. Notice her placement in the composition. She's positioned directly in the center, just as Geraldine was in George Bellows' painting. Of note also is Dinnerstein's limited color palette, black, values of gray, and the brown tones. The bag hanging at her side is accented by the brightly colored flowers. We see a diagonal line where the pavement meets the wall behind Maggie, creating depth in the composition and bringing her out more toward the viewer. Let's compare contrasting scenes created by two realists, Andrew Wyeth and John Koch, as their use of line distinguishes the environments created. One of the greatest realists in the middle of the 20th century was Andrew Wyeth. Son of a renowned illustrator, he was homeschooled by his father, where he and his siblings gained a greater understanding and appreciation for the fine arts. The mediums used predominantly by Wyeth were watercolors and egg tempera. Cowbirds was painted with watercolor on paper in 1988. Wyeth once said, "I paint my life." And he did just that. His favorite subjects to draw and then bring to life with paint were scenes of the land and people around him. The focal point in this scene is a church in Maine, isolated in an environment, painted using very limited color tones, surrounded by cowbirds. Our eyes are drawn to the triangular linear shapes of the peak of the church and angular roof lines and windows. Notice the line patterns created by the birds in the foreground, as well as those along the roof line and in the sky. We move indoors to the elegant setting, painted by Ohio-born realist John Koch. Unlike Andrew Wyeth, Koch's early training was minimal. Yet after high school graduation, he moved to Paris and painted on his own for 4 years. The environment set in a room in Koch's spacious New York City apartment showcases a piano lesson given by his wife. Notice the masterful combination of outdoor and artificial light cast in the interior scene. Of special note is the diagonal line created by the direction of the gaze of the pianist and Mrs. Koch's hand gesture connecting the two sides of the scene, divided by the glass shelves in the middle of the composition. Through art and artistic expression, American realism attempted to portray the exhaustion and cultural vigor of the figurative American landscape and the life of ordinary Americans.